The fantasy genre is vast. It's the neon-lit backstreets of urban fantasy, the shadowy corridors of dark fantasy, the swashbuckling chaos of pulp, and the mysterious doors of portal fantasy. Over the past months, we've dived deep into these different subgenres in a series of videos, breaking down what makes each of them unique, why they speak to the audience, and how they shape the stories we love. So today, I thought, why not bring it all together? Consider this your guided tour through the many realms of fantasy, from the grim to the whimsical, the grounded to the surreal.
If you've been following this series, you know how wildly different the subgenres can be. And if you're new here, welcome. This video is your all-access pass to everything we explored so far. We'll revisit the defining traits, themes, and standout works from each subgenre. And maybe along the way, you'll discover a corner of fantasy you hadn't thought to explore yet. So settle in, grab a drink, and let's journey through the best of what fantasy has to offer. You will find timestamps for each subgenre in the video description, and whether you'll watch this whole beast of a video with your full attention, or just leave it playing in the background while you do some chores, hope you have a good time. A lot of passion and work went into this, and I hope it comes across. Without further ado, let's get to it.
Epic fantasy. The ideal place to start could be no other than epic fantasy. What is so captivating about the worlds of The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, and The Wheel of Time? These epic fantasy stories feel alive, brimming with history, culture, and magic extending beyond the main conflict. Middle-earth enchants with its ancient myths and detailed languages. Westeros intrigues with its complex politics and morally grey characters. And the vast lands of Randland awe us with their diverse cultures shaped by millennia of prophecy and conflict. Each world immerses us and makes us feel like we're living in it.
The idea of the video is to dissect what is special about epic fantasy world building and what other fantasy subgenres can learn from it, from developing a deep sense of history and culture to weaving them seamlessly into your narrative. Let's figure out what can be practically done to bring your epic fantasy world building to life. Let's get to it.
Epic fantasy is defined by several key elements that distinguish it from other fantasy subgenres.
For starters, I want to explore which are these key elements that make epic fantasy what it is. When I think of epic fantasy, the world building needs to be both deep and wide. Deep in the sense that it feels like the author fleshed out a lot of the history, and wide in the sense that it feels like the author knows what is beyond the borders of the geographical region in which the story is contained, even when it's not explicitly on the page.
At the heart of every great epic fantasy lies a deep and complex lore that makes the world feel like it existed long before the story began. Ancient wars, fallen empires, and forgotten gods influence the present and characters' lives. There is no better example of this than Middle-earth. Its rich tapestry of lore stretches back to the creation of the world, the rise and fall of Númenor, the forging of the Rings of Power, and the ancient conflicts with Sauron and Morgoth create a sense of weight and consequence that permeates every corner of the story. Frodo's journey to destroy the One Ring is both a personal mission and the culmination of millennia of struggle and sacrifice, with echoes of past heroism and tragedy shaping the stakes of the present. In Middle-earth, the world feels alive, where every ruin, song, and tale carry the burden of untold stories, drawing readers into a universe that feels as vast and real as our own. In epic fantasy, landscapes can also be used to add characterization to the societies that inhabit them, influencing their traditions, languages, and ways of life. For example, in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, the harsh, storm-battered world of Roshar creates resilient and adaptive societies. The Alethi, living on the high storm-exposed plains, build their cities in sheltered areas and develop a militaristic, survival-oriented culture. In contrast, the Shin, who reside in the quiet, sheltered valleys, have a peaceful, agrarian lifestyle and view warfare as dishonorable. These stark differences in geography reflect directly in the cultures, languages, and moral frameworks of these people. It helps to make a setting immersive, when the author thinks about how geography and cultural aspects of a society influence and are influenced by the people in it. When you spend some time thinking about this, you avoid making the societies in your world building feel like cardboard cutouts.
Another trope of epic fantasy for me is how high the stakes are. There are a lot of fantasy stories out there with a slice of life, cozy, domestic kind of scope, but epic fantasy usually has stakes that involve the fate of entire nations or even the planet. There are epic battles between good versus evil, and the decisions made by the characters can really scale.
Epic fantasy thrives on high stakes. The scale of conflict elevates the story to mythic proportions. These stories often explore themes of good versus evil, though not always in simplistic terms, as the protagonists must confront moral ambiguity and personal sacrifice. For example, in the Chronicles of Narnia, the battle between Aslan and the White Witch represents a clash between hope and despair, life and eternal winter. The stakes are also personal for the Pevensey siblings, who must grow into their roles as leaders and make difficult choices, but the conflict also holds cosmic implications for all of Narnia. Frodo's quest to destroy the One Ring is both a personal journey and a battle for the soul of Middle-earth, with the looming shadow of Sauron threatening to plunge the world into eternal darkness. In the Wheel of Time as well, the struggle against the Dark One is an existential fight for reality itself, with the fate of past, present, and future hanging in the balance. Be careful though, a large scale doesn't necessarily mean the reader will automatically care about the fate of the setting, if you didn't lay the groundwork for that before.
Another way the world building in epic fantasy feels expansive is the large cast of characters. Heroes, anti-heroes, mentors, and villains, all playing their role to contribute to the world building's complexity. The subgenre also often employs multiple points of view to explore different facets of the world and central conflict.
For example, A Song of Ice and Fire uses a broad array of POV characters to reveal the complex politics, cultural nuances, and personal stakes across Westeros and beyond. The audience gains a multifaceted understanding of the world by seeing the story unfold through the eyes of rulers, soldiers, commoners, and outcasts, where every character's choice ripple across the larger narrative, enhancing its depth and emotional impact.
The final element I believe characterizes epic fantasy is heroism. The hero's journey will often be explored, even if in a more subtle way in some cases. The subgenre deals a lot of war and conflict in an epic scale, so this usually lends itself to exploring heroism and heroic sacrifice.
At the heart of epic fantasy lies the hero's journey, a transformative quest that propels the protagonist toward their destiny while shaping the world around them. These quests often involve defeating an evil force, reclaiming lost power, or uncovering their true purpose. Along the way, the protagonist undergoes growth, evolving into a symbol of hope or change. Rand al'Thor in The Wheel of Time begins as a humble farmer but grows into the Dragon Reborn, grappling with the burden of saving the world while wrestling with his own humanity. Geralt in the Witcher series embarks on a journey of self-discovery, balancing his identity as a monster hunter with his moral compass and his connections to those he loves. These transformative journeys reflect the struggles of growth and change, making the characters both larger than life but also relatable. Epic fantasy is not perfect though.
And depending on what you want to explore in your story, maybe it is not the most recommended subgenre for you to use as a starting point. Next, I want to discuss some of the weaker aspects of epic fantasy.
Like any subgenre, epic fantasy is not without its flaws. While we love immersing ourselves in these sprawling narratives, there are a few areas where epic fantasy can fall short. Let's look at some of the common pitfalls and limitations that come with these stories. Epic fantasy often prioritizes world building and grand narratives over character depth, resulting in archetypal or predictable characters. Heroes may feel like vessels for the plot, rather than fully fleshed out individuals. Because the narration feels sometimes ethereal and distant, it is hard to convey your character's struggles in a human and visceral way, like Grimdark usually achieves better.
This makes a lot of sense though. If your world is endlessly complex, but also your characters, it becomes quite difficult to establish a through line for the plot, and you can also end up bogging down your pacing. But with this in mind, if you're interested in reading or writing stories in which characters are super complex and contradictory, epic fantasy may not be your best pick.
Due to the sprawling scope of epic fantasy, the pacing can drag, with lengthy exposition, travel sequences, or subplots slowing down the story. Think of Wheel of Time and how much the intricate descriptions, often repetitive, bog down the pacing. If you're looking to read or write stories in which the plot keeps moving forward in a streamlined and solid pace, maybe epic fantasy isn't for you. Epic fantasy often relies on well-worn tropes such as the Chosen One, the Dark Lord, or a quest to save the world. Without fresh twists, these can feel stale or predictable. If you really like these tropes, you may try to write them in a way to explore what they actually mean, or subvert them instead of just including them at face value, which may cause the reader to feel like you didn't think too much about what you were trying to achieve with their inclusion. The emphasis on grand, world-changing events can sometimes overshadow smaller, more personal stakes, making it harder for readers to emotionally connect with the characters.
On a rational level, you may understand why the end of the world is a bad thing, but it won't matter to you if the author didn't spend enough time making you care about the characters on a micro level. Also, keep in mind that smaller stakes can be emotionally resonant too.
Themes of good versus evil can feel simplistic or one-dimensional, with villains often portrayed as irredeemably evil and heroes as paragons of virtue, leaving little room for moral ambiguity. It gets a bit surface level as well when an entire race is depicted as evil or good. It often comes across as lazy and simplistic. The desire to showcase intricate lore and history can lead to heavy-handed info dumping that disrupts the story's flow and immersion. It is often better to convey world-building elements, weaving this information in a sparse and subtle way, or maybe through dialogue in a way to also convey a character's point of view about that element. The sheer length of epic fantasy series can deter readers, with some stories stretching across dozens of books, often with diminishing returns. This leads to a problem in which it becomes impossible for the author to tie back all the story threads in a satisfactory way, which leads to our final problem. With so many threads and characters, epic fantasy often struggles to deliver satisfying conclusions, leaving unresolved arcs or rushed endings.
In a multiple novel epic fantasy series, think of how many threads are initiated by the author. It is a gargantuan task to tie them all at the end in a way that feels satisfactory. No wonder Martin is taking so long to finish A Song of Ice and Fire. He seems like a perfectionist and is probably exploring a lot of different story paths to see what fits the whole story better. Now, I want to move on to discussing some iconic examples of epic fantasy, if you really want to be well versed on the subgenre. Let's briefly discuss the most relevant ones and what they do specifically well.
Obviously, I cannot make this list without Lord of the Rings. It is the gold standard for epic fantasy when it comes to history, languages, and mythology. Middle-earth feels real because it has such a deep backstory, ancient wars, fallen kingdoms, and even fully developed languages like Elvish. Every detail, from the songs to the ruins, makes you feel like this world has existed for thousands of years, long before Frodo's journey even starts. The narration, however, can feel sometimes a little ethereal and disconnected to the characters' humanity in a more personal level. If you want a fantasy series that goes all in on complexity, Malazan, Book of the Fallen, is where it's at. Steven Erikson throws you into a world packed with complicated societies, ancient gods, and a magic system that doesn't follow the usual fantasy rules. The story isn't afraid to challenge you, but the payoff is a world that feels massive and full of mysteries you'll want to unravel. A Song of Ice and Fire is all about the messy, morally grey side of fantasy. It's political scheming, shifting loyalties, and personal ambition on a huge scale. And then you've got the looming threat of the White Walkers and the mysteries of places like Valyria, which add a mythic vibe to the gritty, real-world drama. The characters are explored in a very intimate and visceral way, which makes the story feel very human and personal, despite the larger-than-life world-building elements. The Stormlight Archive has one of the most unique fantasy worlds out there. Roshar is defined by constant, devastating storms that influence everything. How people build their cities, how plants and animals survive, and even how the magic works. It's a world where every detail ties back to the environment, making it feel fresh compared to more traditional settings. It is not my favorite, but does a good job at honoring more traditional aspects of epic fantasy while still feeling fresh. Epic fantasy is a genre of grandiosity. Its world building should have histories, unique cultures, and complex magic systems make them feel alive, while the expansive casts and epic conflicts can keep us hooked. But it's not without its challenges. Sometimes the characters can feel a bit thin, the pacing can drag, or the sheer scope can overwhelm both writers and readers. Still, when done well, epic fantasy offers a one-of-a-kind experience that's equal parts awe-inspiring and deeply human. Dark fantasy. What if your hero is a monster barely holding onto their humanity? What if the setting is dangerous and malevolent, twisting hope into despair? Dark fantasy asks us to walk into darkness, but what draws us to those darker corners? Is it the twisted characters, the ominous worlds, or the sense that the light might not win this time? Dark fantasy gives us flawed, desperate survivors. It shows us the cost of magic, and the necessity of moral compromise. It's a genre where every shadow holds danger, and even the most powerful are haunted by their choices. If epic fantasy invites us to dream, dark fantasy dares us to confront the nightmare. In this video, we're exploring the unique ways dark fantasy builds worlds dripping with dread, the complex characters navigating moral gray zones, and how it uses themes like corruption, decay, survival, and sacrifice to grip us by the throat.
Dark fantasy takes the grandeur of epic fantasy, which we already explored in the previous video, but trades its shining ideals for moral ambiguity, flawed heroes, and worlds where light isn't guaranteed to prevail. If epic fantasy is about heroism and hope, dark fantasy is about survival and sacrifice. Let's talk about what makes this genre so compelling and how to channel its unique flavor for your own storytelling. Let's get to it.
Dark fantasy may be a little bit harder to define because it has a lot of different branches. What all of them have in common, however, is how much they differ from the shiny, hopeful tone of classic fantasy. These stories thrive on grit, worlds that are dirty, dangerous, and unforgiving. The tone is often bleak, with characters who don't always know if they're doing the right thing, or even if there is a right thing. It's not about heroes saving the day, but about people clawing their way through corruption and decay, sometimes just to survive. The beauty of this tone is its honesty. Life isn't always fair, and neither are these settings.
Fear is a constant companion in dark fantasy. Fear of what's lurking in the shadows, fear of betrayal, and sometimes fear of oneself. Corruption is everywhere, infecting everything from magic to governments to the characters themselves. But it's the fragility of hope that makes dark fantasy hit so hard. When everything is bleak, even the tiniest glimmer of light feels monumental. It's about finding or losing that shred of hope in a world that seems determined to crush it.
Some of the common elements in the subgenre include dark magic, dangerous and corrupting, often with a price that's too steep to ignore, curses symbolizing the burden characters may carry, and a pessimistic worldview that assumes the world is succumbing to moral and actual decay.
The worlds themselves feel oppressive and hostile, like they're actively working against the characters. The heroes are rarely noble paragons. They're flawed, morally complex, and sometimes not much better than the villains. And speaking of villains, dark fantasy loves to pit its characters against powerful, intimidating antagonists who embody the worst aspects of the world, challenging the heroes to either rise above or sink to their level.
It's tricky sometimes to put these subgenres into boxes, but I would consider Grimdark as a branch of dark fantasy. It's a subgenre where the worlds are brutally unfair, morality is a luxury, and even the so-called heroes are often just as flawed as the villains. There's a cynical edge to it. Hope exists, but it's fleeting, and survival often comes at the cost of one's humanity. Gothic fantasy is also another branch. It blends the supernatural with a heavy dose of atmosphere and melodrama, often set in decaying castles, eerie landscapes, or shadowy towns. It's a genre soaked in mystery, tragedy, and the tension between humanity and the unknown. The tone is darkly romantic, exploring themes of obsession, death, and human ambition. Take Bloodborne. Its haunting world of Arnhem is steeped in Gothic architecture and eldritch horror, where madness and blood-soaked rituals drive the story. Or Dracula, which captures the eerie allure of Transylvanian castles and the tragic seduction of vampirism. And Frankenstein, where Mary Shelley crafts a tale of ambition gone horribly wrong as Victor's obsession with creating life leads to ruin and despair. Gothic fantasy thrives on beauty and horror intertwined. Urban dark fantasy would be another branch. It brings the supernatural into the modern world, blending gritty cityscapes with magic, monsters, and mystery. The tone is often sharp, fast-paced, and laced with danger. Think of Neil Gaiman's Sandman, where Morpheus, the Lord of Dreams, moves through our world and others, weaving haunting tales that explore the power of stories and the human psyche. Urban dark fantasy thrives on showing how the supernatural hides in plain sight, just under the surface of our everyday lives.
I could think of many other branches of the subgenre. Some sword and sorcery stories could also be categorized as a dark fantasy. Even Witcher would be a good fit for that. Cosmic horror is often explored with dark fantasy as well. Like a lot of Lovecraft's work, there's also paranormal, post-apocalyptic, and psychological dark fantasy. But we can go on and on here. Let me know in the comments if I forgot anything.
World building in dark fantasy leans heavily on atmosphere. Unlike epic fantasy's grand sweeping landscapes, dark fantasy settings often feel claustrophobic, hostile, and oppressive. The world itself can act like an antagonist, whether it's a cursed swamp, a city teeming with corruption, or a land ravaged by endless war. The goal is to make the environment reflect the story's tone, so readers feel the weight of despair and danger with every step the characters take. Magic in dark fantasy is rarely the shiny, awe-inspiring tool it can be in epic fantasy. Instead, it's more like playing with fire, unpredictable, corrupting, and almost always coming at a high price. Maybe a spell drains the user's life force, or maybe it unleashes consequences far worse than intended. This makes magic feel dangerous and adds a layer of tension to its use. Every time a character taps into it, readers should be on edge. In dark fantasy, societies often mirror the tone of the world, broken, corrupt, or ruled by oppressive regimes. Institutions that might offer hope in epic fantasy, like noble kings or wise councils, are often rotting from within, serving self-interest or exploiting the weak. The common people might be struggling to survive in a system designed to crush them, while those in power cling to their thrones through deceit and tyranny. The Witcher is a quintessential example of dark fantasy world building with its bleak tone. The continent is a hostile and oppressive land, its swamps and war-torn villages teeming with danger and despair. Magic is a double-edged sword offering immense power at a steep and often corrupting cost. While those who wield it are feared and distrusted, society mirrors this decay, with noble houses mired in scheming, common folk crushed under oppressive systems, and monsters both literal and metaphorical lurking everywhere.
When building a dark fantasy setting, think of it as a character in its own right. One that's broken, dangerous, and out to get your protagonist. Maybe the land is dying, poisoned by some ancient curse. Maybe the people themselves are twisted by fear and greed. Don't explain everything outright. Let your readers feel the unease in the crumbling ruins, the whispered legends, or the way the air feels heavier on the atmosphere of the setting. And don't forget scarcity, whether it's food, clean water, or even hope. When survival is a struggle, every decision feels bigger, every moment tenser. Make the world reflect the grim reality your characters are up against.
Dark fantasy thrives on flawed heroes, characters who are far from perfect and often wrestle with their own darker instincts. These protagonists feel more human because they're not always selfless or noble.
Maybe they're haunted by past mistakes, tempted by power, or driven by revenge. What makes them compelling is that their struggles feel real and their victories, however small, come hard-earned. It is not about being a shiny beacon of hope. It's about surviving in a world that's determined to break them and still finding a way to move forward, even if it means walking a darker path.
Griffith from Berserk is a prime example of a character who starts as a hero but descends into darkness. Ambitious and charismatic, Griffith is driven by his dream to rule a kingdom, but his willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone leads to catastrophic consequences. Griffith's arc is captivating because it goes with the genre's themes of corruption and the cost of power. making him both tragic and terrifying. In dark fantasy, the best villains are driven by their own desires, fears, or warped sense of justice. These are antagonists who feel like real people, not caricatures. Maybe they see themselves as the hero of their own story, or maybe their actions stem from pain, betrayal, or desperation.
A villain with depth makes the conflict feel more personal and nuanced, challenging the protagonist in ways that go beyond physical confrontation. When we understand why a villain does what they do, even if we hate them for it, their presence becomes unforgettable. I definitely don't buy into the current trend that we should go back to villains that are evil for no reason. This is just not interesting enough in my opinion.
Cersei Lannister is a fantastic example of a complex villain. She's ruthless, manipulative, and capable of horrifying acts, but her motivations are rooted in her love for her children, her resentment over being dismissed as just a woman, and her desperate need to secure power in a world stacked against her. While her methods are often cruel, her actions make sense within her worldview, and you can even sympathize with her struggles at times. She desperately craves power, but is so utterly miserable to be stuck in this vicious cycle of death, maneuvering and paranoia to maintain it that it makes her arc hauntingly tragic. In the subgenre, battles are rarely fought to save the world or protect ideals. They're about survival.
Characters often make desperate choices, not because they're heroic, but because they want to see another day. The stakes feel more visceral when the fight is for something as immediate as life itself.
In The Last of Us, the battles Joel and Ellie face are about surviving in a post-apocalyptic landscape, teeming with infected creatures and desperate humans. Every fight feels raw and immediate, from fending off clickers in the dark to defending against ruthless scavengers. The show and game capture the relentless tension of survival, where every decision, no matter how small, could mean life or death.
It's not about clear lines between good versus evil, but about tough choices with no perfect answer. These shades of gray make the story richer, forcing both the characters and the audience to question their own sense of morality.
In A Song of Ice and Fire, characters like Jaime Lannister embody this complexity. He starts as a seemingly arrogant villain, infamous for killing a king he was sworn to protect. But as the story unfolds, we see different layers of him. Jaime's actions, while often brutal, stem from a sense of loyalty and love for his family, as well as a code of honor that's at odds with his reputation. In a bleak world, hope becomes rare and powerful. It's not the grand, sweeping hope of epic fantasy, but small, fragile moments that shine all the brighter against the darkness. In Pan's Labyrinth, a young girl clings to a fantastical world of fauns and labyrinth to escape the horrors of war. Her moments of wonder are fleeting, but they underscore the importance of finding light, even when it's nearly extinguished. Now, let's discuss some practical tips to make a dark fantasy setting work. Dark fantasy thrives on atmosphere, and your language is the key to crafting it. Use evocative, sensory-driven descriptions to immerse readers in the story's darkness. Instead of just saying, "The forest was creepy," describe the clinging mist that muffles every sound, the faint scent of decay carried on the air, or the brittle outer crunch of dead leaves underfoot.
Paint the shadows with vivid detail, so readers can feel the dread creeping in. The stench of rot, the flicker of a dying torch, or the sound of distant whispers can all bring your setting to life in haunting and memorable ways.
In dark fantasy, the weight of despair can feel overwhelming if it's relentless. Balance is key. Let your characters and readers breathe with small moments of relief or triumph before plunging back into the shadows.
These pauses create emotional peaks and valleys, making the darker moments hit harder. Think of a group of survivors sharing a quiet meal, laughing nervously before being plunged into chaos again. Pacing in dark fantasy is about contrast. The glimmer of light makes the following darkness feel all the more suffocating.
Dark fantasy thrives when it upends traditional fantasy tropes. Use the familiar, heroic quests, noble knights, or benevolent rulers as a foundation, then twist it into something unexpected. Maybe the chosen one is manipulated into causing destruction, or the wise mentor has a darker agenda. Dark fantasy is where the familiar comforts of traditional fantasy are stripped away, leaving us with worlds that are dangerous, oppressive, and morally complex. It's a genre that thrives on flawed heroes, powerful and layered villains, and themes of survival, corruption, and hopelessness. The worlds feel alive and hostile, the magic dangerous and costly, and the battles personal and raw. From gothic castles and cursed swamps to modern cityscapes teeming with dark forces, dark fantasy invites us to confront the shadows, both in the world and within ourselves. Pulp Fantasy. Forget noble knights and shining armor, paladins and chosen ones. In sword and sorcery, your hero is most likely a roguish wanderer, a thief with a quick wit, or a mercenary who fights for the coin, survival, or revenge. The stakes are not about saving kingdoms or fulfilling grand prophecies anymore. They are about one man's life, freedom, or pride. They're about surviving another day, chasing a treasure, or exacting personal revenge. Welcome to Sword and Sorcery, the pulpy, gritty cousin of high fantasy. It's a genre that strips away epic battles and grand destinies and instead plunges us into taverns, brimming with intrigue, cursed ruins, and one-on-one duels in the dead of night.
In today's video, we are diving into the visceral, thrilling subgenre of sword and sorcery. We will explore what makes this subgenre so compelling, how it focuses on the personal rather than the grandiose, and why it still holds a place in the minds of fantasy fans. It's a genre where the heroes are flawed, the villains are dangerous, and the line between the two is razor thin. If epic fantasy is the symphony, sword and sorcery is the rock anthem. Welcome to the rougher side of fantasy. Let's get to it.
Sword and Sorcery is fantasy stripped down to its core, raw, immediate, and unapologetically thrilling. Forget about saving the world or fulfilling ancient prophecies. This genre hones in on survival, personal ambition, and personal stakes. It's the story of a lone warrior fighting for their freedom, a cunning thief chasing one last score, or a sellsword facing impossible odds. Not for glory, but because they need the coin to eat. It's about the here and now, where decisions are made on instinct. Survival is never guaranteed, and even the smallest victory feels hard-earned. The tone, gritty and grounded, with flashes of dark magic or ancient forces lurking at the edges. The world is rarely kind, and the heroes are rarely flawless. Let's talk about Conan the Barbarian, the poster child of sword and sorcery. Conan is a thief, a warrior, and sometimes even a pirate, driven by survival, treasure, and the occasional grudge. His stories are about him sneaking into a cursed temple to steal a jewel, fighting off an ancient sorcerer, or surviving a brutal betrayal. What makes Conan so compelling is how human he is. He's cunning, resourceful, and fearless, but also very flawed. He doesn't fight for ideals or glory, he fights for what he can hold in his hands. Gold, revenge, or simply the chance to live another day. That raw, unapologetic focus on the personal is what makes Conan so enduring in the genre.
Sword and sorcery is all raw, personal moments, and what is right in front of the characters. The stakes may not seem grand in a traditional sense, but they are immediate. These are characters who fight for survival, freedom, or revenge. And that's what differentiates the genre. It lives in the moment, to the point that a lot of stories are like procedurals, in which nothing changes in the status quo every week, and it's just about the monster of the day that's being defeated by the hero. Now that we have a better idea of what sword and sorcery is, let's explore its origins.
Sword and Sorcery traces its roots back to the pulpy, gritty storytelling of the 1930s and 1940s, when magazines like Weird Tales brought thrilling, fast-paced adventures to the readers. These were tightly woven, self-contained tales that hooked you from the first sentence and didn't let up. Writers like Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, and Michael Moorcock became the defining voices of the genre, creating worlds where danger was around every corner and heroes carved their paths through sheer will, wit, or the swing of a blade.
The stories leaned heavily into the fantastical and the primal, embracing ancient ruins, cursed artifacts, and magic that was as dangerous as it was alluring. Sword and Sorcery is escapist fun, but also explores themes of power, survival, and human ambition in a much more personal way than epic fantasy. It was pulp at its finest, bold, unapologetic, and endlessly entertaining.
We already discussed a bit about Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, but Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser is also worth mentioning. The story is a cornerstone of sword and sorcery, and for good reason. These two unlikely companions, a towering northern barbarian and a sly, quick-witted thief, bring a sense of camaraderie and fun character dynamics to the genre. Together, they navigate the corrupt city of Lankhmar, facing bizarre foes and deadly sorcerers, all while cracking jokes and forming a bond that feels very human. Leiber's stories bring a sharp wit and a touch of melancholy to the genre.
I usually like to look at the cultural context at the time this subgenre became popular to understand what influenced the popularity. Sword and sorcery emerged during a period of significant cultural and social change, particularly in the early 20th century, when pulp magazines blew up. We had the Great Depression, the aftermath of the Great War, and the approach of World War II created a world rife with uncertainty, economic hardship, and disillusionment. People were looking for escapism, and sword and sorcery provided a gritty, action-packed outlet that contrasted sharply with the more optimistic and idealized narratives of traditional epic fantasy. The lone wolf, morally ambiguous type of characters of sword and sorcery spoke with audiences who felt disillusioned by institutions and great ideals. These stories were focused on personal survival, ambition, and individual agency in a chaotic and cruel setting, which reflected the fears and struggles at the time. The genre showcased the desire for stories that acknowledged the harshness of the reality while offering cathartic escapism, and it also showed people were losing faith on the morality of the institutions.
Unlike epic fantasy, sword and sorcery doesn't need sprawling continents or multi-layered maps to create a compelling world. Instead, it thrives on localized settings, a single city teeming with intrigue, a cursed forest full of predators, or an ancient temple hiding deadly secrets. These worlds may be smaller in scale, but they're alive with detail. The focus isn't on the breadth of the world, but the depth of the places the characters explore. You don't need to memorize an encyclopedia of lore to follow along. The story gives you just enough to feel the weight of the history and the danger of the moment.
Take a bustling city as an example. It is a backdrop and a labyrinth of shadowy alleys, bustling markets, and taverns filled with whispered deals and veiled threats. A single ruin in sword and sorcery can feel like an entire universe because of the way the atmosphere draws you in. And the immediacy of the settings create an intimacy with the narrative. You don't need an entire world being designed because the small locations are already detailed enough. You're not exploring distant lands with a bird's eye view. You're in the thick of it, feeling the grit of the cobblestones or the chill of the cursed air. So the locations become personal and essential to the plot.
Let's talk about Nif the Lean. The titular thief embarks on adventures that bring him to eerie, hyper-focused settings brimming with atmosphere. One such place is the underworld-like realm of Gulb, where every element of the setting oozes danger and decay. Gulb is an oppressive, hellish space filled with grotesque creatures and bizarre, otherworldly architecture. The compact setting heightens the sense of peril and mystery.
The intimate scale here enhances the tension and immediacy of Nif's adventures. It really embodies sword and sorcery's knack for creating worlds that are not very wide but deep, small but immersive. Now that we know the scale of sword and sorcery's world building, let's explore how magic is handled in the genre.
Magic in sword and sorcery is a wild, unpredictable force that operates more like a dangerous storm than a tool to master. It doesn't come with rulebooks or clear boundaries. It's chaotic, rare, and often terrifying. Unlike the structured, almost scientific magic systems we see in epic or hard fantasy, magic in this genre feels ancient and unknowable. It's not something the heroes typically wield themselves, but something they encounter, fight against, or are reluctantly forced to use. Sorcery is an ominous presence, its power always coming at a cost, and its users are usually individuals with their own twisted agendas.
Think of the sorcerers in these stories. They're usually priests of forgotten worlds, necromancers communing with the dead, or shadowy figures drawing power from cursed artifacts or from shady sources. These are not your wise mentors or kindly wizards. They are manipulators. They're often detached from human morality, seeing people as pawns or sacrifices in their arcane experiments. Magic in sword and sorcery is more about atmosphere and danger than flashy fireballs. It might manifest as a forbidden ritual, whispered in the dark, a demonic presence lurking in the shadows, or a cursed object that corrupts anyone who touches it. Its rarity makes it even more unsettling when it does appear. What makes this approach to magic as compelling is how it reinforces the journalist's themes. Magic isn't there to solve problems or make life easier. It's there to complicate things, to tempt, to corrupt, and to challenge. A mercenary might face a dark sorcerer raising the dead, or a thief might steal a cursed gem only to find themselves haunted by the ancient entity. Magic in sword and sorcery, it's about survival, and the heroes are often pitted against forces far beyond their comprehensions.
In Elric of Melnibone, Michael Moorcock gives us one of the most haunting depictions of magic in sword and sorcery through Elric's cursed blade, Stormbringer. This sword is a force of dark magic that grants Elric incredible power, but at a cost so steep. Stormbringer feeds on the souls of its victim, growing stronger with every life it takes. Friends, allies, even those Elric loves, aren't safe from its hunger.
There's a tragic irony in how Eric relies on the sword while despising what it makes him do. This duality is what sword and sorcery does so well. Magic in sword and sorcery isn't something to admire or strive for. It's constant temptation and a curse, and it works really well as a way to test characters and to provide challenges to their character arcs. It's about moral struggle, dangerous consequences, and the way it shapes the characters who dare to yield it.
Sword and sorcery heroes stand in stark contrast to the noble knights and destined chosen ones of epic fantasy. They're not burdened with grand prophecies or the fate of the world resting on their shoulders. Instead, these characters are rogues, mercenaries, and outcasts, people trying to carve out a life in harsh, unforgiving worlds. They fight not for honor or glory, but for survival, revenge, or the thrill of the fight. Maybe they're hunting for treasure to buy their next meal, avenging a betrayal, or just trying to stay one step ahead of the next deadly threat.
What makes these characters so compelling is their flawed humanity. They're not paragons of virtue. They're messy, complicated, and sometimes selfish. But their resourcefulness and grit are what draw us in. When faced with overwhelming odds, they don't call on divine intervention or destiny. They rely on their wits, their skills, and sheer determination. Sword and sorcery heroes are relatable because they're imperfect, and their stories resonate because they feel immediate, raw, and personal.
Conan is the archetype, a barbarian who rises through sheer strength and cunning, but isn't, however, a one-dimensional brute. He's a thief, a warrior, and eventually a king. His motivations are deeply personal. These characters thrive in the moral gray zone, navigating worlds that are just as treacherous as they are. Geralt of Rivia is a modern archetype of sword and sorcery, a brooding, morally ambiguous monster slayer for hire. As a witcher, Geralt is an outcast, mutated and trained to fight creatures that most people fear to even name. His world is harsh, and his motivations are grounded in survival, personal codes of honor, and sometimes coin. But what sets Geralt apart is his complexity. He may come across as stoic, but he's capable of great compassion and introspection. Themes like the corruption of power and the cost of freedom are at the heart of sword and sorcery stories. These tales often follow characters who desire independence, wealth, or revenge, only to discover that the price of these pursuits is higher than they imagined. A lone warrior might escape servitude, but find that freedom means constantly fighting off enemies. A thief could strike it rich, but lose their humanity in the process, becoming consumed by paranoia and greed. These stories thrive in the gray areas, where the line between hero and villain blurs, and survival often demands difficult, morally questionable decisions.
The moral complexity also provides a lens to explore universal themes like ambition, sacrifice, and trust. Power in these settings is often a curse. It's a heavy burden that tests the limits of the character's resolve. The cost of achieving one's goals often leaves scars. And this is a minefield for compelling storytelling. Asking for a cost for victory is such a compelling way to make your character arcs more interesting. Sword and sorcery shows us that every victory comes at a price, and even survival can be bittersweet.
Sword and sorcery strips fantasy down to its raw, visceral essence. Gritty characters, immediate stakes, and a world that's as dangerous as it is enthralling. It's a genre about flawed heroes fighting for survival, treasure, or revenge. Rather than lofty ideals or the fate of the world, Sword and Sorcery thrives on personal stakes and thrilling high-stakes adventure. It's a genre where every decision has a cost, every victory comes with scars, and every step forward feels earned. Steampunk. Today we are exploring worlds where the hum of steam engines fills the air, where inventors push the limits of possibility with clockwork creations, and where airships glide through smoky skies. This is steampunk, a genre that blends the elegance of the Victorian era with the grit of industrial innovation. But what does steampunk mean as a subgenre besides the visuals, the gadgets and goggles? And what is it trying to say?
Hey guys, today we're going over the world of steampunk. I want to explore the elements that make this subgenre, from world building to themes, and the idea here is to break down what makes steampunk tick, pun intended. We are going to explore its key components, uncover what makes it so compelling, and show you how to use its unique style to create great stories and worlds. So grab your goggles, fire up the engines, and let's get to it.
Alright, let's start with the basics. What is steampunk? At its heart, steampunk is all about creating a world where steam power is the driving force behind technology. Think a place where the Industrial Revolution didn't stop. It just kept going, fueled by steam engines instead of electricity. Well, try to ignore the horrifying environmental consequences of it for the sake of immersion. Now throw in the fashion of the Victorian era, corsets, top hats and goggles, but with a twist. Instead of just people in fancy dresses, you've got clockwork arms, steam-powered gadgets, and airships soaring above the streets. It's a unique blend of history, technology, and imagination. Think of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It's a good example in cinema of how steampunk blends Victorian fashion with cutting-edge tech, at least for the time. You've got Victorian-era characters, Sherlock Holmes, Mina Harker, and Captain Nemo, but they're wielding all kinds of steam-powered technology, from mechanical monsters to airships, making for an action-packed adventure.
Now, steampunk is not exactly just Victorian science fiction. It's this interesting mashup of retrofuturism, adventure, and a whole lot of what-if scenarios. With this subgenre, you imagine a different version of the world, where technology went down a different path. It's like a what if we kept steam power as the primary source of energy. You can kind of see how this creates a unique kind of wonder, almost like nostalgia for a past that never existed. This is not particularly exclusive of steampunk as a subgenre though. If you think about Lord of the Rings or A Song of Ice and Fire, for example, they also use old medieval Europe as a basis for the setting and evolve it in a way that fits their world building and plot requirements with the fantastical elements. And steampunk does pretty much the same thing, but with the Victorian era and Industrial Revolution instead of medieval Europe, if you think about it.
Another good example is Steam Boy, an animated film set in an alternate version of Victorian London where steam technology has progressed to the point of creating super-powered machines. The film is a visual feast of giant mechanical suits, enormous steam-powered contraptions, and of course an entire city built around this technology. It really shows the wonder that comes with a world where steam is the king of innovation.
While steampunk has this gorgeous nostalgic look and feel, it's also a genre really focused on rebellion. A lot of the steampunk stories, they take aim at things like class systems, imperialism, and unchecked ambition. And it makes sense if you think about the source period. England was expanding their empire and also really focusing technological development and invention. It's kind of like the journalist's way of saying, look at what happens when we don't keep our ambitions in check. And it's all wrapped up in the beautiful, opulent trappings of the Victorian age. So while it might seem all about the elegance and airships, it's also making some serious points about the darker sides of progress.
A great steampunk film that dives into this rebellion is Brazil, though it's a bit more dystopian. It's full of that steampunk vibe. The movie is set in a bureaucratic, over-industrialized world where people are treated like cogs in the machine. It critiques the overwhelming control of technology and government, all while maintaining that dark, whimsical steampunk aesthetic with its giant machines and quirky inventions. It's like the genre's way of showing what can happen when technology is misused. Now, let's go over some of the must-haves when it comes to steampunk. Let's start with the visuals because, let's be honest, they're what first draw a lot of people to steampunk. It's rooted in the architecture, clothing and design of the Victorian era, but it takes all of that and dials it up to 11. Elegant dresses with intricate lacework, but now they've got hidden compartments for weapons or gadgets. Think top hats, but with built-in telescopes or tiny mechanical gadgets ticking away inside.
It's about taking the refinement and sophistication of Victorian culture and fusing it with the wild experimental vibe of an alternate industrial revolution. The world itself feels like stepping into a living, breathing machine. Think of towering buildings made of iron and glass, streets lit by gas lamps that hiss with steam, and laboratories packed with giant gears, tubes, and steam vents puffing out clouds of smoke.
A good example is the film Sherlock Holmes. The gritty streets of Victorian London are brought to life with an industrial edge. There is machinery everywhere, steam clouds floating through the air, and even the crime-solving tech feels like a blend of old and futuristic. It's that solid mix of sophistication and mechanical madness that makes steampunk so captivating. Steampunk worlds are built on the magic of steam-powered technology. In these settings, steam powers everything, from massive zeppelins floating majestically through the skies to mechanical automatons clanking through cobblestone streets. It's all about asking those what-if questions. The possibilities are endless, and that's what makes steampunk so exciting. It's innovation with a vintage twist.
One of the coolest things about steampunk tech, it's how it balances practicality with a sense of whimsy. On one hand, it's functional, designed to solve real-world problems in creative ways. On the other hand, it's kind of quirky and full of character, like brass gadgets with unnecessary gears, or automaton with a monocle for no reason other than the aesthetics. And let's be real, who wouldn't want to tinker with a steam-powered gadget? It's the kind of tech that makes you want to roll up your sleeves, grab a wrench, and dive into the workshop, even if it sometimes feels impractical.
Most steampunk stories take us back to the 19th century. It's a reimagined world where science and society took a completely different path. Instead of electricity leading the charge, steam remains king. Picture sprawling cities powered by gigantic steam engines, with bustling streets full of inventors, mechanics, and adventurers. It's a world where innovation feels tangible, gears turning, pistons pumping, and steam hissing.
Steampunk explores a reality where humanity's potential unfolded in strange and fascinating ways. And while originally a lot of steampunk leans heavily into Victorian England, the foggy streets of London, the aristocrats in waistcoats, it doesn't have to stop there. You can imagine what a steam-powered world would look like in other cultures.
What about a Japanese steampunk empire with clockwork samurai and steam-fueled rickshaws? Or an African steampunk kingdom blending tribal aesthetics with intricate brass machinery and airships that ride the desert winds? The genre thrives when it steps outside of its comfort zone and brings a fresh perspective to the table. After all, steam technology might power the world, but every culture would shape it in its own unique way. At its core, a lot of steampunk stories are about rebellion. It's inventors challenging the status quo, workers rising up against oppressive industrial systems, and underdogs using ingenuity to take on powerful forces. There's always this tension between tradition and progress, between the old ways of doing things and the unstoppable march of innovation. And that's what makes it so relatable. It's not just about what we build, but about who gets to control it and at what cost. Let's take a look at the Mortal Engine. It's a perfect steampunk story drenched in rebellion and progress. You've got these massive steam-powered cities on wheels, literally devouring smaller towns to survive. It's industrialization taken to its most extreme. The rebels are the heart of the story, using wit, resourcefulness, and sometimes outdated tech to take on this monstrous system. It's a great example of how steampunk can blend epic visuals with strong themes. Alright, so you want to build your own steampunk world. Where do you start? Let's talk steam tech. Because in a steampunk world, it's the engine that drives everything. Literally, The first thing to figure out is how advanced your steam technology is. Is it grounded and practical, like trains, factories, and machinery that feel like they could have existed in the 19th century? Or do you want to push the boundaries and imagine a world where steam can do almost anything, like powering intricate computers, steam mix, or even entire floating cities? Deciding how far you want to take it is key, because it sets the tone for your world.
Are you creating something greedy and realistic, or wild and fantastical? Defining the boundaries of your technology in the setting is particularly important for steampunk because the subgenre is about ingenuity and innovation. When the rules of what the tech can and cannot do are clear, it makes it exciting when a character finds an ingenious way to overcome a challenge by using it.
Your steam tech should be a storytelling tool. If your tech is grounded, your world might focus on social struggles like factory workers rising up against oppressive industrialists. On the flip side, hyper-advanced steam tech could drive stories about mad inventors, global exploration, or even a race to harness the next big breakthrough. For example, think of a steampunk submarine capable of diving to previously unreachable depths. What mysteries could it uncover? It makes me think of 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas by Jules Verne. The level of steam tech you choose can shape your plot, but also give your world a unique flavor. Let's talk about who's calling the shots in your steampunk world. A lot of steampunk stories lean into the classic divide between the wealthy aristocrats and the struggling workers. You've got the upper class living in luxury, throwing extravagant parties in their airship mansions, while the inventors, factory workers, and street-level tinkerers are down below, hustling just to survive.
The dynamic sets up natural tension, workers rebelling against the elite, or inventors finding clever ways to rise above their station. It's a great way to reflect on your wish issues, privilege, and exploitation, while keeping the story grounded in the steam-powered aesthetic. But here's the fun part. You don't have to stick to the same old structure. What if your steampunk world flips the script, for example? Maybe the inventors are the elite, holding the power because their inventions drive society forward, and maybe the aristocrats now scramble to stay relevant.
Or how about a society where automatons form the underclass, doing all the labor while humans focus on art and invention? That setup could lead to some interesting conflicts, like automatons gaining sentience and demanding rights. The beauty of steampunk is that it gives you the freedom to play with these power dynamics in unexpected ways. When we think of steampunk, it's easy to picture the foggy streets of Victorian London, with gas lamps glowing and gears turning. But why stop there? The world is full of rich cultures that can breathe fresh life into the genre. Imagine an Indian steampunk empire with massive steam-powered elephants and inventors designing intricate brass machinery inspired by traditional patterns, a bit like Kaladesh in Magic the Gathering. Steampunk out of its comfort zone can make your world stand out and feel truly unique. Think of the possibilities. Desert airship ports where merchants haggle over mechanical parts, or jungle cities where ancient temples are fused with steam tech, their gears churning to unlock hidden mysteries. Even the Wild West can go steampunk, with steam-fueled trains racing through dusty landscapes and bandits wielding clockwork weapons. Every great steampunk story needs conflict, and it often comes down to a clash of ideologies. Is your world grappling with progress versus tradition, where inventors and visionaries clash with those clinging to the old ways? Or maybe the danger lies in unchecked innovation, with technology spiraling out of control and threatening the balance of society. Then there's the classic steampunk staple, a class revolution where the industrial elite face rebellion from the inventors they exploit. To create an immersive steampunk atmosphere, weave in mundane everyday details that feel authentic to the Victorian Age and Industrial Revolution. Think about the food your characters eat, meals of meat pies or cheap bread for the working class, contrasted with lavish banquets of roast beef and wine for the elite. Costumes can ground your world too. Soot-streaked aprons and patched trousers for factory workers, or tailored waistcoats, corsets, and top hats for the upper class, with perhaps a brass goggle twist to reflect your steampunk flair. But don't stop at aesthetics, dive into the mindset of the era, reflect the rigid social hierarchies, the obsession with propriety, and the belief in the inevitability of progress. Maybe an inventor dreaming of endless possibilities, or a worker bitterly watching the march of machines take their job.
Whatever the tension is, it's the ideological battles that gives your words stakes and themes. These themes can really resonate because class wars and the cost of ambition and technological progress are still very present these days. Just look at late-stage capitalism and its consequences, and the discourse around billionaires, and obviously climate change, right?
Steampunk is a genre bursting with creativity, depth, and storytelling potential. The reimagined Victorian aesthetics bring the visuals, and its themes of rebellion and progress bring the depth. Steampunk gives us a canvas to blend imagination with commentary on the human condition. The brass and gears bring flavor to interesting explorations about the cost of ambition and technological progress, how innovation can still be used as an exploitation tool and to reinforce societal structures and the fear and excitement of progress. Romantasy? Romantasy. Just hearing the word seems to spark all kinds of debates in fantasy. Some people love it, saying it's brought in an element of emotionality lacking in some general fantasy. Others, not so much. They see it as a plague flooding the genre with overused love triangles, brooding bad boys, and of course monster boyfriends. Love it or hate it, you can't deny that books like A Court of Thorns and Roses, Fourth Wing, and From Blood and Ash are everywhere right now. But here's the big question, is Romantasy shaking things up in a good way? Or is it watering down what makes fantasy great? And what does all of this mean for the future of the genre?
In this video, we're finally diving into the Romantasy phenomenon. We're going to explore why it became so popular, unpack the criticisms, and look at what Romantasy brings to the genre. Is it really just watering down fantasy? Is Tolkien turning on his grave over the billionth depiction of a toxic, dysfunctional relationship on page with a fantasy coding? Or could this be a gateway for new audiences and an evolution of storytelling? Stick around as we examine the good, the bad, and everything in between to answer the question, is Romantasy a threat to fantasy? Let's get to it.
Let's start with the basics. What exactly is Romantasy? It's a subgenre of fantasy, where romance is central to the plot, woven into the story alongside other fantasy aspects. Think of it as fantasy, or a fantastical world as a background to longing stares, dramatic confessions, and the plot sometimes just acting as a contextual glue between different intimacy scenes. Let's call it like that, monetization purposes. The staples of Romantasy often include tropes like enemies to lovers, fated mates, and forbidden love. Classic setups that keep readers flipping pages out late into the night. It's where magic meets melodrama, and for some readers that's the sweet spot. From a sales perspective, Romantasy is dominating the fantasy market right now. Titles like Fourth Wing have topped bestseller lists within weeks of release, with publishers rushing to print additional copies to meet demand. A Court of Thorns and Roses has sold millions of copies worldwide and even sparked plans for a TV adaptation, showing the subgenre's crossover potential. On platforms like TikTok, Romantasy titles are some of the most discussed books, driving massive sales spikes and making it easier than ever for new authors to break into the market. With fans creating fan art, posting reviews, and hyping up new releases, Romantasy has become a cultural phenomenon. For publishers, it's clear that Romantasy is a lucrative and growing part of the fantasy genre.
You scroll through this hashtag on your feed, and you're probably going to see endless praise for series like A Court of Thorns and Roses, Fourth Wing, or From Blood and Ash. These books offer a perfect storm from escapism, swoon-worthy love stories, and just enough world building to make it fit the fantasy criteria. Not everyone is on board the Romantasy train, while some readers adore the subgenre for its focus on character relationships, others worry it's sidelining what makes fantasy great. Imaginative world building in magic systems, epic battles, political intrigue, you name it. So, does Romantasy simplify fantasy? That's the big question we're tackling today. So, let's dive into what Romantasy actually does right, what it could do better, and whether it's helping or hurting the fantasy genre as a whole.
One of the biggest criticisms Romantasy faces is that it prioritizes romance at the expense of everything else. Critics argue that while traditional fantasy focuses on world building, magic systems, political aspects, and grand themes, Romantasy often focuses more on the personal stakes. Long-winded descriptions about how badass the female protagonist is and how muscular, broad-shouldered, and virile the male love interest is. These things take precedent over saving the world or fighting cosmic forces. Another common complaint is the heavy reliance on certain romance tropes. Love triangles, brooding bad boys, and fated soulmates are everywhere in Romantasy. And while these can be fun, they can also feel overused if not done well. It's not that these tropes are inherently bad, they're beloved for a reason, but when they dominate the story, it can make the genre feel formulaic.
So if we talk about Romantasy, or maybe just book talk as a opinion-forming entity, may also be commodifying fantasy. The books are literally categorized into tropey tags, to the point that you can filter, for example, to buy a book online, enemy to lovers, slow burn romance, love triangles, to find the books that fulfill those tropes and may interest you, which creates a problem in which the actors are churning out these books with a checklist of tropes to fulfill, like they're preparing a Big Mac menu. It cheapens art to a degree, but hey, if you're having fun with it, go for it. Another troubling criticism of Romantasy, it's how we can romanticize toxic relationships. The bad boy trope is a staple in the genre, often crosses the line from brooding and mysterious to outright abusive and toxic. They are sometimes portrayed as domineering, emotionally manipulative, or controlling. Yet, these behaviors are framed as signs of passion and protectiveness. The issues arise when those toxic traits are glossed over or excused because the love interest is attractive, powerful, and has a tragic backstory. For some readers, this sends a harmful message about what love should look like, especially for younger audiences who might take these fictional relationships at face value. But mostly Romantasy's rise sparked debates about how it affects the broader fantasy genre. Some argue that its popularity gives fantasy a lighter, less serious image. Critics worry that the success of Romantasy might push publishers to prioritize similar stories, sidelining traditional fantasy in favor of romance-heavy plots. However, it's worth asking, is that a problem with Romantasy itself, or is this simply the results of changing readers' preferences? Either way, it's clear that Romantasy is reshaping the genre's landscape, and not everyone is happy about it.
One thing Romantasy many times does well is emotional exploration. Romance has this way of making readers feel personally invested in the characters and their journeys. Sure, saving the world is exciting, but when you throw in a relationship where the characters' love for each other is tied to the stakes, it has the potential to hit on a different level. While traditional fantasy often glosses over romance or awkwardly shoves it into the background. Sorry, Sanderson fans, but his romance arcs can feel like afterthoughts written by a 13-year-old. When Romantasy explores this huge side of the human experience, it can contribute to the world's feeling more lived in. Romantasy brings more diversity to the fantasy genre, especially in its focus on female protagonists and relationships. For years, traditional fantasy has been dominated by male-centric narratives. Romantasy flips that script by putting women and their perspectives at the center. This shift has attracted a broader audience, including readers who might never pick up a traditional fantasy book but are drawn to the emotional intimacy and character-driven stories in Romantasy. It's about expanding what fantasy can be and who it can speak to.
The way I see it, Romantasy can also be a gateway into the broader fantasy genre. Many readers start with Romantasy, falling in love with the world building and magical elements as well, and then they move on to explore more traditional fantasy works, going further down their rabbit hole. Beyond that, Romantasy has done wonders to the genre's visibility in mainstream media, but it is hitting a different demographic and making fantasy accessible to a wider range of people, which is a good thing. Love it or hate it, Romantasy is putting fantasy into the spotlight, and that's something traditional fantasy hasn't always been able to do. Again, the main gain here with Romantasy, in my opinion, it's getting different perspectives being portrayed on the genre that we love.
I already mentioned here some of the most popular series in the subgenre, but let's go over them in a bit more detail. Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses, or Kotar, is arguably the cornerstone of modern romantasy. The series starts as a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but quickly evolves into a sprawling tale of fae politics, high-stakes battles, and relationship exploration. The enemies to lovers trope between Fire and Rysand is a fan favorite, offering a classic slow burn development that feels fairly earned. Rebecca Yaros's Fourth Wing has taken the Romantasy world by storm, combining the romance of the genre with a fast-paced, high-stakes plot centered on a deadly dragon riding academy. The book's appeal lies in its intensity, both in its romance and its action. The enemies to lovers dynamic between Violet and Xaden is another fan favorite. The inclusion of dragons, each with unique personalities and bonds with their riders, adds another layer of world building. It strives for a mix of action and romance. Jennifer L. Armentrout's From Blood and Ash series is a romantasy powerhouse, blending romance with a mix of mystery, mythology, and rebellion. The story follows Poppy, a young woman raised as the Maiden, forbidden to be touched or to speak freely, as she discovers hidden truths about her world and herself. The series leans heavily on the fated mates trope. Armentrout also weaves in elements of mythology and supernatural lore, building a world filled with gods, vampires, and ancient secrets. Of course, certain tropes pop up time and again in romantasy, and part of their appeal is how they are used in new and familiar ways. While some might see these tropes as predictable, fans argue that it's all about the execution.
So I gotta be honest, romantasy is not my cup of tea. Don't get me wrong, I love complex relationships of all kinds being explored. You know, relationship dynamics, highlighting aspects of both characters involved in them, and their interaction influencing each other's arcs. Writing this sort of thing well is super hard, and a lot of heavy hitters of fantasy could benefit for having more of this. But at least mainstream romantasy, at the moment, is not doing this yet for me. These works that I mentioned here are passable at best when it comes to this, but I'm still open to the idea of the genre. I hope to find something romantasy related that takes this approach and execute this with quality, because I have nothing against the idea of it, just the execution. So if you have an example of this that I'm talking about, please let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to read it.
Obviously, romantasy doesn't need to replace traditional fantasy. They can peacefully coexist. The beauty of fantasy as a genre is how flexible and diverse it is. There's room for sprawling epics like The Lord of the Rings and character-driven romantasy like A Court of Thorns and Roses. They cater to different audiences, but they're not mutually exclusive. The coexistence of these subgenres enriches the fantasy world, offering something for everyone. But that doesn't mean romantasy is perfect, though. How can we make it better? Well, for starters, we can allow both fantasy and romantasy to bleed into each other a bit better so we can get a best of both worlds sort of effect. God knows a lot of fantasy works out there can learn a thing or two about writing nuanced relationships. Not only romance, but also friendships, mentorships, etc. that don't just feel like bluntly conveying on a page your D&D character's file list of personality traits. Some authors are already finding ways to strike this balance. These kinds of stories prove that it's possible to have the best of both worlds, romance that's meaningful and fantasy that's immersive.
So, in my opinion, romantasy has a lot of potential if it addresses its criticisms in a good way while staying true to its core appeal. For one, authors could lean into deeper world building, ensuring that the settings feels just as alive and detailed as the relationships. And hey, what the hell, maybe even make your world building details reflect aspects of the relationship you're trying to portray. The world building could work as an allegory, for example. They could also experiment a little bit more with romance plots that are less predictable. Move beyond the love triangles, fated mates, and enemy to lovers formulas to create dynamics that feel fresh and surprising. At the end of the day, in my opinion, fantasy as a genre is better off when it embraces variety and when it's open to explore different things. Romantasy brings in new readers who might never have picked up a traditional fantasy book, while traditional fantasy keeps the genre grounded in its roots. Together, I think they can broaden what fantasy can be, making the genre more dynamic and accessible. So, Instead of seeing Romantasy as a threat, we can view it as an expansion of fantasy's possibilities. With all of this said, I do hope that whatever is becoming popular in Romantasy at the moment, it's better written. So,
is Romantasy ruining fantasy? Honestly, the answer is no. It's easy to criticize the subgenre for its overuse of tropes or for prioritizing romance over other fantasy staples, but Romantasy is expanding what fantasy can be. It's bringing new readers into the genre, offering fresh perspectives, and creating emotional, character-driven stories that many people clearly love. Sure, it's not perfect. There's room for improvement in how it handles world building, relationships, and originality, but that's true of any genre. Romantasy isn't here to replace traditional fantasy, it's here to coexist with it, adding to the diversity of stories fans can enjoy. Urban fantasy? Today, it's urban fantasy's turn to be explored, a subgenre that asks us what supernatural forces may lie beneath the surface of your city. In the depths of the subway, ancient sigils hum with forgotten power. Urban fantasy is a subgenre that blends the mystical with the mundane, merging supernatural elements with modern settings. It's a world where ancient magic thrives in the shadows of skyscrapers, where fey creatures have contracts with corporate lawyers, and where supernatural beings live side by side with humans, sometimes in harmony, often in secret, and occasionally in outright conflict.
So, urban fantasy has exploded in popularity recently, from books to TV shows, movies, and even video games. What this subgenre has that is kind of interesting, how it is easily mixed with other subgenres of fantasy. It can also vary a lot in tone, from more whimsical to dark, even though more recent urban fantasy that tends to be a bit grittier. And it can also vary a lot in terms of how much of fantasy immersion you have with your setting. And today we're here to talk about it all. So let's break down what makes urban fantasy unique, the key tropes that define it, and how different creators have put their spin on the genre. So let's get to it.
Urban fantasy is all about the collision of magic and modernity, fantastical elements woven into the everyday world we recognize.
Unlike high fantasy, where your entire setting is shaped by magic, urban fantasy asks a different question. What if magic was real but hidden beneath the surface of our own regular world? What if the guy sitting next to you on the subway is a century-old warlock? What if the alley behind your favorite coffee shop was actually a portal to another realm? This is what makes urban fantasy so intriguing. It brings the extraordinary into the familiar, making our world feel just a little bit more mysterious. Now, it's quite easy to mix up urban fantasy and contemporary fantasy, since both take place in modern settings. But there is a key difference. Urban fantasy, like I mentioned today, tends to be a bit grittier, darker, and often has a more noir or thriller-like feel to it. It leans into hidden magical societies, supernatural crime, and secret power struggles happening just outside of human awareness.
Think of it like this. In contemporary fantasy, magic is often out in the open or treated with wonder, like in Percy Jackson, where the gods and monsters actively interact with modern society. In urban fantasy, magic is usually something dangerous, hidden, and tightly controlled. Like John Constantine, where stepping into the supernatural world comes with consequences. The genre thrives on contrast. The neon lights of the city against ancient sorcery, the hum of a car engine mixing with the whisper of a summoning ritual, or a detective chasing a murderer, only to find out they're a werewolf. Urban fantasy takes the raw energy of city life and injects it with just enough magic to make you wonder, what if?
Urban fantasy thrives with the blending between familiar and the fantastical, setting its stories in modern cities infused with magic. The settings can be real locations like Chicago, New York, or London, where supernatural elements exist just beneath the surface. Or they can be in entirely fictional cities with their own mystical undercurrents. The key is that magic isn't out in the open. It's hidden, operating secret societies, underground networks, or just beyond the perception of everyday people. It could be a vampire-run nightclub, a back alley potion dealer, or like an ancient magical order disguised as law firms. If you think about it, this concept just extrapolates something that exists already in the real world. Sometimes you live decades in a big city and you're not even aware of all the underbelly or all like the secret clubs and underground societies that exist there. There's so many different lives being lived that you don't have access to thanks to your little bubble. Fantasy just extrapolates this concept to a magical degree. The secrecy about urban fantasy lends itself to action, mystery, and noir influences. As urban fantasy usually follows a protagonist that investigates, uncover, or become entangled in secret underground conflicts. Private detectives investigating occult murders, bounty hunters tracking rogue warlocks, or just ordinary people stumbling into hidden magical conspiracies. These are just common setups for the genre. Urban fantasy also thrives and mix between different fantasy races, from vampires to werewolves, for example. Fae are also super popular these days. Demons, ghosts, angels, sorcerers. Each tribe often exists in their own structured little world, with roles, hierarchies, and supernatural politics. So, good urban fantasies usually establish these tensions between the different races very well, and also the tension between them as supernatural entities and ancient forces lurking beneath the surface in our real society.
Think of the Dresden Files, where Harry Dresden, Chicago's only wizard detective, investigates crimes that blur the line between the mundane and the supernatural. Vampires running nightclubs, fae making shady back alley deals, and dark magic lurking beneath the city streets, all while the general public remains oblivious.
So again, the contrast between the supernatural and the ordinary is super important. They should be properly established. At its best, urban fantasy turns the modern world into a place where extraordinary things are just one wrong turn away. But now it's time to go down into the nitty-gritty. Let's explore the actual tropes and themes that make urban fantasy what it is.
Urban fantasy thrives on recurring tropes that help define its identity while allowing for endless variation. One of the defining features of urban fantasy is the idea that magic exists, but most people have no idea. The supernatural operates in secret, with creatures, sorcerers, and ancient beings blending into the background of everyday life. In Harry Potter, the wizarding world has an entire government dedicated to keeping magic hidden from muggles. Supernatural creatures exist beneath the surface of human society. This trope allows urban fantasy to create a dual world, one that mirrors our own, but is filled with hidden dangers, ancient conspiracies, and secret factions lurking just beneath the surface. The isolation of the protagonist often makes them the perfect lens through which to explore themes of alienation, identity, and moral ambiguity. In a world where magic lurks beneath the surface, their detachment allows them to navigate the underbelly of society, uncovering the corruption, power struggles, and hidden truths that others ignore. The lone wolf's journey is one of survival, of finding meaning in the shadows or even being engulfed by it. Urban fantasy is heavily influenced by classic noir storytelling, borrowing elements like dark cityscapes, morally gray characters, and a sense of danger lurking around every corner. The protagonist often finds themselves caught between factions, working cases that reveal hidden, supernatural conspiracies, where power is dangerous and alliances are fragile. Think of the Dresden File, where a wizard detective navigates both the human legal system and supernatural politics, or Constantine, where an occult detective walks a fine line between good and evil, dealing with angels and demons. This noir influence gives urban fantasy a grounded, gritty tone, where the supernatural world isn't just mysterious, it's corrupt, ruthless, and deadly. A major theme in urban fantasy is how magic interacts with modern legal systems, crime, and politics. If supernatural beings exist, how does society deal with them? In True Blood, vampires have come out of the coffin and fight for legal rights, while in Rivers of London, a special police division investigates magical crimes. This theme grounds the supernatural in reality, exploring how laws, government agencies, or secret supernatural councils handle crime, territory disputes, and power struggle. Do werewolves have to register as dangerous creatures? Are there magical laws preventing demons from making contracts with humans? These questions help flesh out urban fantasy world, making them feel lived in and immersive.
So keep in mind that exploring how the magic actually hides in the world, thrives, and clashes with our own reality can make the story very interesting. I do think it could be a bit challenging to word build in urban fantasy though, because not only you need to think about all the mechanics of your secret setting, you also need to think about how all of these secret mechanics fit into the regular setting and how both can coexist without the secret one being exposed it's not an easy thing to achieve. Think of Harry Potter. It's so easy to poke holes into the logic of the world that it kind of takes you out of the immersion if you think about it for like 10 seconds. But okay, with that out of the way, let's move on to some iconic examples of urban fantasy and what they bring to the table.
Urban fantasy has taken many forms across different types of media, from books and comics to TV shows, movies, and games.
So, as we know by now, the genre has its common themes and tropes. A lot of the stories we're going to explore next bring some unique flavor to the table and put their own unique spin on the formula. So let's take a look at some of them.
Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files is one of the most definitive urban fantasy series, following Harry Dresden, a wizard and private investigator operating in modern-day Chicago. As a supernatural detective, Harry handles cases that range from missing persons to demonic conspiracies and vampire wars, all while dealing with a world that either fears or denies the existence of magic. The series blends hard-boiled noir, fast-paced action, and sarcastic humor, with Harry constantly getting himself into trouble, whether it's battling ancient fey queens, negotiating with the White Council, or just trying to pay his rent. With its mix of detective fiction and supernatural intrigue, The Dresden Files is one of the most influential urban fantasy franchises, proving that magic and modernity can create compelling, gritty storytelling. John Constantine is one of urban fantasy's ultimate anti-heroes, a cynical, chain-smoking, occult detective who deals with demons, ghosts, and other supernatural horrors. Originally introduced in DC Comics' Hellblazer series, Constantine is a master of dark magic and trickery, constantly outwitting both angels and demons, while making enemies everywhere he goes. His world is steeped in gritty noir aesthetics, where magic is dangerous, every favor has a price, and even the protagonist's victories often come at a terrible cost. Whether in comics, films, or TV adaptation, Constantine is the perfect example of urban fantasy's darker, more horror-infused side, where magic is both a tool and a curse, and the supernatural world is just as corrupt as the human one. His blend of sarcasm, rebellion, and tragic heroism has made him one of urban fantasy's most iconic characters, proving that sometimes the best weapon against the supernatural is just a well-timed con. The World of Darkness universe has been one of the most influential urban fantasy settings in gaming, covering everything from vampire and werewolf clans to secret societies of mages and haunted ghost realms. Its most famous installment, Vampire: The Masquerade, introduced a world where vampires live in secret, manipulating human society from the shadows while navigating ancient feuds and power struggles. The franchise is known for its dark, political, and morally ambiguous storytelling, dealing with rival factions, supernatural laws, and internal conflict. Whether through tabletop RPGs, video games, or LARPs, World of Darkness has shaped how urban fantasy portrays the supernatural, not as all-powerful monsters, but as creatures trying to survive, keep their secrets, and hold on to their humanity. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is a genre-defining urban fantasy TV show, mixing supernatural horror, teen drama, and action into a story about growing up while fighting monsters. Set in the seemingly normal town of Sunnydale, Buffy Summers juggles high school, friendships, and battling the supernatural as the latest in a long line of vampire slayers. While Buffy herself is a chosen warrior, she's not alone. Her friends, the Scooby Gang, help her face off against vampires, demons, and apocalyptic threats lurking in the shadows. What made Buffy stand out was its ability to blend the magical with the mundane, using supernatural elements as metaphors for real-life struggles like love, loss, addiction, and identity. Its mix of snarky dialogue, action, and horror elements cemented it as a major influence on modern urban fantasy storytelling.
I think these stories show that urban fantasy is a highly adaptable subgenre. It is capable of mixing elements of mystery, horror, action, and even comedy to create compelling modern myths. It goes from the detective noir of The Dresden Files, the supernatural teenage drama of Buffy, the political intrigue of World of Darkness, and the cynical occult horror of John Constantine. So each of these examples are bringing a different flavor to the subgenre, and to the idea of magic coexisting with the modern world. But again, the magic of urban fantasy is injecting fantasy and mystery into a regular setting, and exploring what lurks in the shadows.
Urban fantasy thrives on its ability to take the familiar and twist it into something mysterious, dangerous, and exciting. It's a genre that asks, what if magic was real, just hidden beneath the surface? and then explores all the consequences of that question. From secret supernatural societies and noir-inspired detectives to hidden magical wars unfolding beneath neon city lights, urban fantasy continues to evolve, blending elements of mystery, horror, action, and drama to create worlds that feel just close enough to reality to make us wonder. Whether it's gritty and cynical or adventurous and fun, the genre remains compelling because it taps into that timeless human fascination with the unknown. The idea that just around the corner, past a shadowed alleyway, or behind a bookstore's locked door, magic is waiting to be found. Portal Fantasy. Today, we're stepping through the portal into one of fantasy's most beloved subgenres, Portal Fantasy. A child stumbles into a hidden world through a wardrobe. A teenager discovers that stepping through a mirror leads to another realm. A scientist's experiment goes wrong, opening a gateway to a dimension filled with horrors. Portal Fantasy is all about transportation, moving from our world to another, whether it's through a mystical gateway, an enchanted book, or even a scientific accident. It's a subgenre filled with wonder, danger, and the thrill of the unknown.
From classic literature to modern TV shows, video games, and movies, Portal Fantasy has remained a staple in the genre. The main goal of the subgenre is to make the audience ask the question, what lies beyond the door? Today, it's Portal Fantasy's turn to be explored. Let's break down what makes this subgenre unique, the tropes that define it, the themes that it often explores, and some iconic examples that shaped what it is today. So let's get to it.
Portal Fantasy is about stepping into the unknown. A protagonist crosses the boundary between their familiar world and a fantastical realm, setting the stage for adventure, mystery, or even horror. Unlike high fantasy, where the world is self-contained and exists independently from our own, Portal Fantasy anchors itself in reality before shattering that sense of normalcy, revealing a hidden world that coexists with or exists parallel to ours.
Some portals can be accidental, dragging an unsuspecting character into a new world without warning. This can create a sense of disorientation because the protagonist is thrown into this new setting with no preparation at all. Other portals are deliberate, they offer a choice. The character decides if they want to cross it or to remain behind. So because of this, the stories often revolve around the themes of temptation, curiosity, or destiny, as the protagonist must decide if they want to take on the call to action and embrace the adventure, or stay within the safety of the world they know. How, if you think about it, the pill scene in the Matrix between the red pill and the blue pill could be seen as an example of Portal Fantasy, because Neo accesses a new world when he makes the decision to allow himself to do it. So even the nature of the portal itself can set the tone for the journey. A glowing door may invite wonder, while something like a cracked mirror may foreshadow something a little bit more sinister. One of the defining features of Portal Fantasy is the contrast between the protagonist's world and the new one they enter. Unlike Isekai, where the protagonists often fully assimilate into their new setting, Portal Fantasy frequently plays with the tension between the two identities, two realities, and two conflicting set of roles. The protagonist is discovering a new world, but they are also fully aware of the one they left behind. And this creates a lot of interesting internal conflict for the character to explore.
In the Chronicles of Narnia, the Pevensey siblings go from wartime Britain to the mythical land of Narnia, where they not only discover talking animals and magic, but also take on new identities as rulers and warriors. Yet, Narnia doesn't erase their connection to home. Britain and their ordinary lives remain part of their identities, creating a push and pull between duty and belonging. In contrast, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland presents a dreamlike journey where Alice is thrown into a bizarre, nonsensical world filled with strange characters and illogical rules. Unlike Narnia, Wonderland doesn't feel like a place where Alice is meant to stay. It is temporary, fleeting, and surreal. It doesn't transform her in the same way. Instead, it challenges her perception of reality before she ultimately returns home. Coraline subverts the Portal Fantasy formula by presenting an other world that at first appears to be a perfect version of the protagonist's real life. Coraline's other mother offers her everything she thinks she wants, until she realizes that this world is an elaborate trap, designed to lure her into giving up her real identity. Here, the portal is not an escape to adventure, but a test of Coraline's self-awareness and resolve.
This contrast between the known and the unknown, home and adventure, reality and illusion, is what makes Portal Fantasy so compelling. The protagonist's journey, of course, it's going to be about how this new world influences them and how it puts the old world into perspective. It should challenge them and force them to make a choice. Some central questions we may ask in a Portal Fantasy setting is, can the protagonist return home? And if they can, should they? Some stories revolve around temporary visits. The portal is a doorway that can be used more than once. The protagonist eventually returns to where they come from, often changed by the experience. If they decide to stay, these decisions should also be explored in the character's journey. These stories emphasize that the journey is a lesson, an adventure that informs their real life but does not replace it.
In The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy travels to the fantastical land of Oz but ultimately chooses to return home, realizing that there's no place like home. The adventure was meaningful, but it was never meant to be permanent. Other stories explore permanence, either by choice or by force. The portal closes or the protagonist makes a decision that ensures they will never return. These stories explore themes of belonging, identity, and sacrifice.
The best Portal Fantasy stories leave us with questions, wonder, and a lingering sense of magic, because deep down it's a very human thing to imagine what would happen if you found a door to another world. A lot of us may just step through. Now it's time to explore some tropes and themes of the subgenre. Let's explore the elements that actually define it from a thematic point of view.
Portal Fantasy follows recurring tropes that shape the genre, allowing for endless variations in tone and style. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. One of the biggest appeals of Portal Fantasy is that it starts in the real world, our world. The protagonist is usually a normal person living an ordinary life before they stumble upon something that changes everything. Maybe it's a hidden door in an old house, a book that transports them into its pages, or a scientific experiment gone wrong. This moment, the crossing from reality into fantasy, is one of the most exciting parts of the genre. It taps into that childhood dream that magic could be just around the corner. For example, Harry Potter doesn't realize he's a wizard until he gets his letter to Hogwarts, revealing a hidden magical world alongside the real one. The portal as a threshold. The portal itself is often symbolic, a doorway that represents change, choice, and transformation.
It can be a physical gateway, like a wardrobe or a rabbit hole, or something more abstract, like falling into a book or being summoned to another world. The nature of the portal can also set the tone for your adventure, of course. A mysterious glowing archway suggests adventure. A cracked mirror leading to a distorted reflection of reality hints at something scarier and more sinister. Or, for example, a door that only appears at a specific time of day may hint at rules that this magic world has that could be beyond human understanding.
For example, in Stardust, a hidden gap in a wall leads to a magical kingdom, separating the mundane from the mystical. The rule of return or no return. Some Portal fantasies focus on temporary journeys, where the protagonist returns home changed by their experiences. Other stories make the journey permanent, either by choice or because the portal is closed forever. A major theme in Portal fantasy is the struggle between worlds. Should the protagonist return home, or have they found where they truly belong? In Narnia, the Pevensey children eventually lose access to Narnia, making their time there feel like a fleeting dream. In Pan's Labyrinth, the idea of whether the protagonist ever truly returns is left to interpretation. The best Portal fantasy stories leave us questioning, if you could stay, would you? Parallel worlds and hidden realms. Not every Portal fantasy takes the protagonist to a completely different world. Some stories present parallel worlds existing alongside our own but hidden from ordinary sight. Example, His Dark Materials features multiple worlds layered on top of each other, connected by the mysterious substance known as dust.
These parallel worlds, they often explore themes of perception, reality, and even what it means to the protagonist to belong here or there. In the best cases, this new world should mirror aspects of our own reality and make us reflect about it. The best Portal fantasy stories use the fantasy secret world as a way to make us think about our own. So now let's go over some iconic examples of the subgenre.
Portal fantasy has shaped some of the most influential fantasy stories across literature, film, and television. One of the most famous and foundational examples of portal fantasy, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, introduces the Pevensey children to Narnia through a magical wardrobe. However, Narnia is not just a world of adventure. It's a place of prophecy, war, and deep moral and spiritual lessons. The passage of time works differently there, with years passing in Narnia, while mere moments elapse in the real world. The children, particularly Lucy and Edmund, undergo profound transformation, learning about bravery, sacrifice, and the weight of destiny. The Narnia series plays with the idea that childhood wonder is fleeting, and the portal is not always open to those who try to return. By the end of the series, some characters are no longer allowed to return to Narnia, reinforcing the bittersweet notion that once we grow up, we can't always go back to the magic of youth. BioShock Infinite. Unlike many fantasy-based portal stories, BioShock Infinite uses the concept of dimensional rift to explore sci-fi and multiverse themes within a steampunk-inspired city in the sky. Elizabeth, one of the main characters, has the ability to open portals to alternate reality, allowing glimpses into worlds where history has played out differently. These moments of stepping between dimensions serve as a darker take on portal fantasy, where instead of whimsical adventure, the journey reveals how small changes can have enormous, often horrifying consequences. Alice's journey through the rabbit hole into Wonderland is one of the most surreal and dreamlike examples of portal fantasy. Unlike traditional portal fantasies, Alice doesn't embark on a grand quest or fulfill a prophecy. She simply experiences Wonderland as an absurd, nonsensical place that challenges her perception of reality. The world is constantly shifting, with strange creatures, illogical conversations, and rules that make no sense. The Mad Hatter's Tea Party, the Queen of Hearts' chaotic court, and the ever-changing size of Alice herself create a sense of instability and disorientation. Wonderland feels more like a puzzle to be solved rather than a kingdom to be explored, making it one of the most unique examples of the subgenre. The story is often interpreted as an allegory for navigating the confusing, unpredictable world of adulthood, a contrast to Narnia, which presents a more structured and morally defined magical world. One of the most interesting science fiction takes on portal fantasy. Stargate replaces magic with technology, but the core idea remains the same. A gateway exists between worlds, and those who step through it encounter new civilization, new conflict, and new challenges to their identity and understanding of reality. The Stargate itself is an ancient wormhole device that allows near instantaneous travel between different planets. Unlike traditional portal fantasies, the protagonists in Stargate don't just stumble upon another world. They are trained explorers, soldiers, and scientists who navigate the unknown with purpose. The series explores diplomacy, war, and cultural exchange. Characters frequently interact with aliens, some advanced, others deeply rooted in mythology, resembling ancient Earth civilization. While the return journey is always possible, each mission through the Stargate leaves a mark on the character, forcing them to grow, adapt, and question their assumptions about power, ethics, and humanity's place in the universe. Unlike Narnia or Alice in Wonderland, where the protagonist is often an outsider in a fantastical world, Stargate presents the portal as a tool for ongoing exploration, shifting the focus from self-discovery to understanding the unknown on a grander scale. One of the darkest and most complex takes on portal fantasy, Pan's Labyrinth blurs the line between fantasy and harsh reality. Set during the Spanish Civil War, the film follows Ophelia, a young girl who discovers an ancient labyrinth and a mysterious faun who tells her she is the reincarnation of a lost princess from another realm. However, unlike traditional portal fantasy stories where the new world offers adventure or escape, Pan's Labyrinth presents a tragic, ambiguous interpretation of portal fantasy, one where the fantasy world might not be real at all. Ophelia's journey is filled with tests and dangers, mirroring the horrors she faces in the real world, particularly from her cruel stepfather, Captain Vidal. The film never fully confirms whether Ophelia truly enters a magical world or if it is a psychological coping mechanism, making it one of the most haunting examples of the genre. Is the portal an escape, a test, or is it simply a child's way of processing the violence and brutality around her? The film leaves that question unanswered, but it reinforces a key theme in portal fantasy: the idea that the world beyond the portal reveals something deeper about the protagonist's reality, whether or not it is real in a literal sense. Grimdark? Are authors misunderstanding or misrepresenting Grimdark? I am a big George R.R. Martin and Joe Abercrombie fan, and at its best, this subgenre gives us complex characters, moral dilemmas with no easy answers, and a world where heroism was about surviving in a cruel, indifferent universe. At its worst, though, it overindulges in sex and violence, for a surface-level representation of adult fiction. And the nihilism is so extreme that no thematic point is being made with the story anymore. Think of Game of Thrones in its early seasons. Characters like Ned Stark, who clung to honor in a world that didn't reward it, or the Hound, whose cynicism masked a deeply wounded soul, but somewhere along the way, Grimdark stopped being about exploring hard truth and started being about piling on suffering. Now, we get stories that confuse brutality with depth, where everyone is awful, everything is hopeless, and there's no real purpose behind the despair. It's not thought-provoking, it's just exhausting.
So, has Grimdark lost its way? I think the problem is that a lot of newer Grimdark stories focus so much on the over-the-top violence and the nihilistic worldview that they forget why the subgenre worked in the first place. Yeah, we get it, the world is bleak, but why does this bleakness matter? What does it say about power, survival, morality, and a bunch of other themes that you can explore? Without this, it just becomes misery for misery's sake, where shock value replaces substance. So, in this video, we're going to break down what makes Grimdark great, where it started to go wrong, and how writers can bring back the depth and nuance that made the genre so complex in the first place.
Like any other subgenre, Grimdark didn't just show up one day. It evolved out of a reaction to the more idealistic, black and white morality of traditional fantasy, which to be fair was getting quite tiresome and out of touch. The term itself comes from Warhammer 40k, with its famous tagline, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." That pretty much sums up the tone. Bleak, brutal and unrelenting. But Grimdark truly gained traction in literature with works like A Song of Ice and Fire, The First Law, and The Black Company, which took classic fantasy archetypes and turned them inside out. What made Grimdark refreshing at the time was how it deconstructed fantasy tropes. It challenged the idea that heroes always win, that good and evil are neatly defined, and that a chosen one's destiny is set in stone. Instead of shining knights and wise wizards, we got morally ambiguous characters navigating worlds that were harsh and unforgiving. Power had consequences, survival had a cost, and sometimes doing the right thing only got you killed. This wasn't just about being edgy for the sake of it. It was about making fantasy feel more grounded, more human, and when done right, that kind of storytelling felt real and added real-world stakes to the fantastic. There's The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. His characters make terrible choices, but you understand why. Logan Ninefingers, a barbarian with a monstrous alter ego, just wants peace, but violence keeps pulling him back in. Jezal, a vain, self-absorbed nobleman obsessed with status and glory. Glokta, a torturer, is bitter and ruthless, but his inner monologue reveals a man shaped by pain and circumstance. These stories explore what it means to live in a brutal world, and of course we can't ignore Game of Thrones. Actions had real, devastating consequences. In spoiler alert, the Red Wedding punished the audience for believing in traditional storytelling justice. But even in this bleak world, there were moments of triumph, love and resilience. That's what made Grimdark compelling. It was about challenging our expectations and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, survival and morality.
Here's the thing though. Obviously, Grimdark was never just about making everything miserable. A lot of Grimdark stories explore themes of power and morality, survival and ideals. The best Grimdark stories don't just shove suffering in your face for shock value. They make you feel the weight of every choice, every consequence. They show you the worst of humanity, sure, but they also ask if there's anything worth holding on to in the darkness. So a good, well-written Grimdark story challenges, provokes, and lingers with you long after the story ends. And to me, that's the root of its success in the last few decades. So where did it go wrong?
Some Grimdark stories mistake being dark for being deep. They pile on suffering, betrayal and cruelty, but forget to explore why the world is so brutal. Take the later seasons of The Walking Dead. Once a show about survival, morality and the cost of leadership, it eventually devolved into an endless cycle of misery. Characters faced death after death, betrayal after betrayal, with little meaningful reflection on what it all meant. It became violence for its own sake, without the emotional weight that made the early seasons compelling. If everything is always terrible, then the audience stops feeling anything, because nothing ever changes.
That's a real issue. Grimdark shouldn't be just bad things happen because bad things happen. There should be some narrative purpose to the suffering. Even on a meta level, it can make us ask questions. For example, what does power do to people? When does survival become cruelty? Can morality even exist in a world like this? Without that kind of exploration, it's just bleakness with no substance. Shock for shock value. And let's be real, if the audience is watching and reading and thinking, okay, so everything is awful forever, got it, then you've lost them. You have to at least breadcrumb some positivity here and there for some peaks and valleys effect, and also to keep hope alive so the moments of awfulness can hit harder.
There's a fine line between using darkness to make a point and using it just to be shocking. Take Game of Thrones, for example. The early seasons were brutal, but the violence served a purpose. It showed the harsh reality of power and the consequences of every decision. But in later seasons, especially after they ran out of source material, the brutality became more about shock value. Think about how Ramsay Bolton's torture scenes weren't making too strong of a point about anything, or how Daenerys' sudden turn into a mass murderer felt like a twist for the sake of a twist. The show leaned so hard into trying to shock the audience that it lost the complexity and nuance that made it special. One of the biggest myths about Grimdark is that it has to be completely hopeless. But even the darkest stories need something to hold on to. Berserk is a very brutal fantasy story, but Guts' drive to keep going, his sheer will to survive and fight back, gives the darkness weight. If Guts had nothing to fight for, if he was just another miserable soul in a miserable world, the story wouldn't be nearly as impactful. That contrast is what makes it powerful.
This is something some of the modern Grimdark stories miss. If everything is awful and everyone is a terrible person, why should the audience care? If there's no hope, no catharsis, no moment where you see that something, anything, still matters, then it stops being a story and just becomes a long, miserable slog. So good Grimdark will probably drag you through the mud, but they want to make you feel something along the way at least. They give you one thing to root for, one thread of meaning in the chaos, because without that, there's no impact, just a never-ending spiral of suffering and backstabbing, and honestly, who wants to sit through that? Another big problem for me is if the story has no moral anchor, it has no meaning. In a setting where everyone is selfish, corrupt, or morally gray, then right and wrong lose all weight and doesn't mean anything. Conflict becomes less about moral dilemmas and more about who's the more cunning or brutal. While Grimdark often prides itself from avoiding clear-cut heroes and villains, and this is often a good thing, the best stories still establish moral contrast, giving the audience something to hold on to. Even if the moral anchor is challenged and ultimately fails, without this contrast, Grimdark risks becoming muddled and static, a bleak, never-ending cycle of self-serving characters making selfish choices in a world where nothing really matters beyond survival and their own self-interest. If there's no tension between different worldviews and philosophies, then what separates a character's actions from another? If every decision boils down to might makes right, then is the story even saying anything?
A Song of Ice and Fire is a perfect example of both Grimdark done right and where it can go wrong. In the early books, characters like Ned Stark and Jon Snow served as moral anchors, flawed but principled men who stood against corruption, making the story not just a cynical look at power, but an examination of whether honor can survive in a ruthless world. However, as the series progresses, those anchors disappear and nearly every major character is morally compromised to some degree. With no one left representing an opposing viewpoint, the story increasingly leans into nihilism, suggesting that everyone is doomed to be consumed by power, betrayal, or cruelty. But if everyone is morally gray, then no one is, because morality ceases to be a defining factor in character conflict. I also wonder if this reason may be contributing to George's difficulty to finish the series. If everything is morally ambiguous and muddled, is it even possible to end the series with a strong point being made about anything at this point? The best Grimdark stories don't erase morality. They challenge it, creating tension between ideals and reality instead of simply asserting that everything sucks, and that's just the way it is. Darkness in storytelling isn't the problem. Meaningless darkness is. The best Grimdark use suffering to reinforce their themes. Take The Last of Us Part 2, 2020. It's one of the most brutal and emotionally exhausting stories in gaming, but it's not just dark for the sake of being edgy. It's about the cycle of revenge, how violence consumes people, and how even justified actions can have devastating consequences. Every horrible thing that happens in the game ties back to that central theme. Now compare that to something like Raised by Wolves. It has a grim, bleak world filled with suffering, but the story often meanders, throwing in more brutality without necessarily reinforcing a core theme.
That's what modern Grimdark is to remember. Before adding another big plot twist, ask, does this moment serve the story, or is it just here to be shocking? You're not gonna write the next Red Wedding. Darkness works best when it highlights the fight against it. If there's no struggle, if the answer is just everything is horrible, deal with it, then what's the point? Darkness is interesting when it's being used as an obstacle to challenge the characters, force them to make impossible choices, and show us why the world is brutal, not just that it is.
Grimdark works best when there's something to break up the bleakness, even if it's just a moment of levity or a fleeting sense of hope. Arcane, for example, is packed with war, betrayal, and suffering, but it also has deeply human moments, friendships, love, and moments of personal triumph. Vi and Caitlyn's growing relationship provides a sliver of warmth in a world tearing itself apart. Even in its most brutal moments, Arcane knows when to slow down and remind us what's at stake. Contrast that with something like The Bastard Son and the Devil himself, a Netflix grimdark fantasy that leans so hard into misery that it barely gave the audience anything to hold on to. Without those moments of hope, the darkness starts to feel repetitive and numbing.
One of the biggest reasons Grimdark stories fall flat is when the characters have no control over their fate, when they're just being dragged along by an uncaring world with no chance to push back. So it's always good to give your characters some sort of agency. Even in the face of inevitable failure, you can still explore their choices.
Now compare that to something like The Northman, 2022. It's a beautifully shot film with a grim and brutal world, but its main character, Amleth, is so bound by fate and prophecy that his actions feel less like choices and more like inevitability.
Happy endings aren't an absolute must, but audiences do need stories where choices matter though. If the characters' decisions never change anything, if their actions are meaningless in the face of all-consuming bleakness, then why should we even care? Grimdark doesn't mean hopelessness, it means earned hope. Even if the world is cruel, even if the odds are impossible, the struggle itself is what makes the story work. Because if your characters believe in something, even when the world tells them not to, then the audience will.
Not all modern, grimdark stories have fallen into the trap of misery for misery's sake. Some authors are bringing back depth, purpose, and contrast, moving away from pure nihilism towards something that some call noble grimdark. These stories still have brutality, corruption, and suffering, but they also allow for moments of hope, loyalty, or resistance against the darkness. Books like Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, The Empire of the Wolf by Richard Swan, and The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang all incorporate grimdark elements, but they also give us characters who fight for something. Even if they don't always win, they show that darkness means more when there's something standing against it. Grimdark isn't bad, it just works best when it has layers. Instead of throwing readers into a pit of despair with no way out, the most compelling grimdark stories challenge both their characters and their audiences to ask hard questions. Is power always corrupting? Is survival worth losing your soul? How do people hold on to their humanity in a world that constantly tries to take it from them? The key isn't to make every story lighter, it's to make them matter. So, you may be drawn to the political intrigue of epic fantasy, the brutal truths of grimdark, whimsical chaos of portal fantasy, or the gritty streets of urban fantasy. In any case, there's a whole spectrum of worlds waiting to be explored. Fantasy thrives because it keeps reinventing itself, morphing through subgenres that each brings something new to the table. And as long as there are stories to tell, these worlds will keep expanding, twisting, and surprising us.
Thanks so much for joining me on this tour through fantasy's many forms. Let me know which of these subgenres is your personal favorite, or better yet, which one do you think deserves more attention? Any subgenre I forgot and you'd like to see in a new video? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this roundup, I'd ask you to leave a like and a comment. Everything here on the channel is free, including our Discord server, which you can find a link to on our channel's page. So the best way to support it's just by helping us out with appeasing the unrelenting algorithm gods. It really makes a difference. So that's it for the video today, and I see you next time.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.